So we're here for fun and frivolity and risk assessment. Our presenters today are two good friends of mine who I'll let them introduce themselves, Eddie Raymond and Jonathan Deull. So gentlemen, take it away.
Eddie,
John.
age before beauty, Eddie.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate you reminding me of that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, my name's Eddie Raymond. I am the retired Vice President Training Director from IATSC Local 16 in San Francisco. Um, I've been a board member and past president of ESTA since 2000. I serve on the IATSC's Craft Advancement Program. I'm an OSHA outreach instructor for the general industry 10 and 30-hour courses that the IATSC puts on. And like I said, I'm generally retired, but not retiring.
Definitely not retiring. And a member of the Long Reach Long Riders motorcycle horde,
That's true.
as are about half of the people on this now. Thanks everybody for coming, for showing up. I'm Jonathan Deull. I am kind of a show business maid of all work. I've done lots and lots of different things. I've been an IA member since the late 1970s. And over the last 20 years have been spending an awful lot of time doing weird and wonderful rigging stuff, both the doing and the learning and the teaching about it, with a particular focus on strange, usually human loads with circuses and acrobats and other kind of one-of-a-kind presentations that are now much less one-of-a-kind than they used to be, because that world has changed a whole lot. I'm fascinated by the topic that we're going to talk about today. Eddie is one of my great teachers, and I look forward to learning from him as I learn from all of you folks that we've been spending a lot of time together. There are a whole bunch of people on this that we've been talking with a lot over the last several months and the last year. And I learn so much from each of you, and I look forward to playing and learning today.
Okay, folks, we're out of time, so thank you both, Jonathan and Eddie, and go ahead. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. Go ahead.
I knew you did. I knew you did. So we're going to talk about risk assessment today. OSHA defines risk assessment as job hazard analysis, which is basically a nice way of saying, what the hell could go wrong and what are we going to do about it? And in our industry, it's pretty common that nobody at the management level understands enough about what we're doing to do an effective risk assessment. So oftentimes this falls on us as the people doing the work to constantly be doing an assessment of the risks that we're facing, the hazards, and to figure out how we're going to keep each other safe while we do our work. Go ahead to the next slide, Jonathan. The main reason that we want to do job hazard analysis or risk assessments is so that we can be aware of our surroundings, so that we can identify those things that could cause us illness or injury on jobs, and then we can take mitigating efforts to make those things disappear, go away, or in some way mitigate the risk to reduce it to an acceptable level so that we can do our work. We're really bad at this. We work in an industry where things are changing constantly while we're doing the work. And because of that, you can't just, it's not a one and done. You can't do a risk assessment or job analysis and say, okay, we're done now. Because as we work, things change and new risks show up. And we have to be aware of them, and we have to make sure that we address them when we find them. Go ahead, next one. So first of all, we want to identify the hazards. You can just bounce through all these, Jonathan. We want to identify potential hazards, things that may not be a hazard now but could change into one. We want to prioritize corrective actions, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to prioritize those things. You want to either eliminate them if you can, or reduce them to an acceptable level. And you're going to use two primary criteria for determining which ones you want to address first and how seriously you want to take them. The first one is likelihood. How likely is something to go wrong, to present a risk, to hurt somebody, to make somebody sick? If it happens a lot, often, then it's something you want to address immediately and you want to continue to look into it as your job progresses so that you can be sure that something hasn't changed that would add risk to something you think you've already dealt with. The second criteria is severity. Somebody getting a scratch is a whole lot less severe than somebody falling to their death. And there's a lot of room in between there. But even if it's something that we do not do very often, if the severity of that accident that could happen is high, then we want to make sure that we prioritize that as something we want to deal with. So the two things we're going to be looking at is how likely is it to happen? And if it does happen, how severe would the result be? So how do we identify those things? It's formulaic in this presentation from OSHA because they want management in particular to do it in a formulaic way and to write it down and to jump into this on a regular basis. But go bounce through these again, Jonathan. Thanks. First of all, you want to do general inspections. That's just taking a lay of the land around you, identifying what's going on, who's doing it, and what the larger vision is of what's going on. Then there are special inspections. For example, in our industry, rigging inspections are different than your general inspection. General inspection, you're just looking at the work. When you go to a special inspection, you're looking at a specific piece of equipment, or you're looking at a specific system, or you're looking at how people do their work, a particular job, in a way that allows you to identify hazards that might exist. Walk around inspections. This is something that we should be doing on a regular basis as jobs are progressing. It's while work is progressing, you walk around and you just observe what's happening, and you're looking at it through the lens of trying to identify potential hazards before they become accidents. Generally, you want to have a checklist for these things, and these are a lot of us who've been doing this for years. You just carry these around your hand. So you got general housekeeping. You have slip, trip, and fall hazards, which is the #1 cause of accidents in most industries. Electrical hazards. Sometimes we need to call in experts who are more specifically skilled in that area to identify those hazards. But general electrical hazards would be something you'd look at. Equipment operation. What equipment are you using? Has it been inspected and maintained regularly? That would be the equipment maintenance half of that. Fire protection. Are the fire exits blocked? I can't tell you how many theaters I've done inspections in where the theater fire exits are blocked by scenery, wardrobe, carts, prop bins, prop tables, ladders, any number of things. Part of our fire protection is being able to evacuate an area in the event of a fire. But are the fire extinguishers charged? Has the fire curtain been tested according to the standard? No. How we organize our work and how the process flows. One of the things that's really interesting about our industry is indeed how we do our work. We're very good at it. I mean, one of my privileges is I get to go around and teach OSHA inspectors about the entertainment industry. And I tell them, what other industry is there in the world where 50 or 60 48, 50-foot trucks show up at 6 o'clock in the morning with a crowd of 200 people who have no idea what's in those trucks. And by 8 o'clock that night, not only have they all been unloaded and assembled, but a show goes on, and at 6 o'clock the next morning, the trucks are rolling away again. We do that because we're very organized and we have a flow to the way we do our work. But when we're doing that flow, other things come up, and we need to be aware of things that interrupt our normal flow of things. If things go out of order for one reason or another, because of scheduling or because materials don't show up or something else, that changes the flow of our work. We need to be aware of that. Our work practices, If you're a rigger, are you clipped in 100% of the time, every time you're off the ground? Well, I can tell you from experience that a lot of people don't. Um, Workplace violence, which regretfully has become more prevalent in the last 10, 15 years than it was before, being able to, as a supervisor in particular, being able to assess a situation from the point of view of how it is affecting people's psychologies and whether it's going to get out of hand or not, and being able to intervene before that happens so that you can head those things off. Ergonomic problems. Lots of us have ergonomic problems from the way we've done our work in the past. And why do we do it that way? Well, it's because it's how it's always been done, right? How many of us have heard that 1,000 times? So, keeping an eye out for ergonomic problems and understanding that ergonomic problems, when you have early intervention, don't lead to long lasting injuries, but when they're not, they can lead to lifelong injuries. Lack of emergency procedures. We were doing our first New World Rigging Symposium down in Fort Lauderdale, and one of the things that we teach when we do our OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 classes is having to have an emergency action plan for foreseeable, likely to happen emergencies that could come up. And I went to the hotel manager, which is what I usually like to do, and I asked to see their emergency procedure, their emergency action plan. And he brought out a 50-page document. And he said, not only do we have one, but we rehearsed it yesterday before everybody showed up for this event. So we're getting better about it. We really are. If I went into a theater and I said, let me see your written emergency action plan for likely things, you're not going to find one in most places. So that's part of the job hazard analysis. Go ahead.
Eddie, can I interrupt for just a sec?
Yes, you can.
Craig Lewis is asking for you to explain what is an ergonomic problem.
Ergonomic problems. How if there's a free, if you like to look it up on the OSHA.gov website, there's a PowerPoint that talks about ergonomic problems. But basically, how often do you lift heavy weights? How do you lift them? Do you lift them properly? What kind of tools are you using? Do they fit your hand? Or if you're experiencing shock from the tools, do you have shock absorbing handles on those tools? Are you exposed to loud noises for long periods of time? Are you working on your hands and knees a lot? If you are, what are the alternatives? How could you get around that? Can you share the work? Being able to spread difficult jobs out among multiple people reduces the amount of exposure to those ergonomic hazards. There's lots of ergonomic issues that come up in every place that we work. If you work at a keyboard all day, if you're a lighting programmer and you sit at a keyboard for 12 hours a day, is your workstation set up ergonomically so that your elbows are square, your feet are flat on the ground, your back is straight, your wrists are not bent awkwardly because your elbows are in the wrong position relative to your keyboard. So ergonomics comes up in absolutely everything that we do.
Yeah, I put into the chat, and there's a couple of other comments, but I put in, pulling a chain hoist out of a road case.
Yep.
It's almost impossible to do that in an ergonomically appropriate, safe way, other than pushing a button and letting electricity do it.
Right.
Okay.
Or getting multiple people to help with it. Loading counterweight, yeah. As some people know, there are places in Europe where counterweight houses don't exist anymore because they're ergonomically dangerous. We go through basically 5 steps when we're doing a risk analysis, and that you can do this on a large scale or a small scale. You break down the job. What are the components to it? What is the progress of the job from point A to point B? As you do that, you identify the potential hazards within each of those steps in the breakdown of the job. You're going to evaluate those hazards for frequency and severity so that you can decide whether there's something that needs to be jumped on immediately and how hard, and what kinds of mitigations you're going to need to keep people from getting hurt until you've actually had time to deal with the larger problems. And then what are safe procedures and protective measures? Now, sometimes we can do things, for example, If we have rigging stuff that can be assembled on the floor rather than in the air, obviously that's a much safer way to do it. So that would be a procedure. Making sure that people have the right PPE when they're doing their work, so that they're wearing hard hats when there's activity going on over their heads. Um, they have the right gloves for the work that they're doing. All those sorts of things. So determine what they are and then constantly revisit and revise the job hazard analysis. Just because you've done a risk assessment does not mean that you are done with this process. It's something that goes on every day, all day long, and it's something that everybody needs to be involved in order to have an effective one. The more people who do the work are involved in it, the better.
Do we want to see if anybody has any quick questions based on what Eddie just said that haven't been up? Because then I'm going to say the same things he said, only different. Okay, well we'll go on. So just to encapsulate what Eddie said, this is a model of perfect risk assessment and in what we do. The thing that it's interesting to point out in preparation for this, I took a look at the ANSI standards that ESTA has created, and not all of them. I didn't look at the electrical or at the atmospheric effects. I looked at the rigging and the safety ones, and I noted that the that risk assessment in some form is either mandated or specifically referenced in 12 of the of our standards that we helped create. That's really good. And if you look at the dates of the ones that have most reference to standards, you'll see they're mostly recent rather. So this idea of incorporating risk assessment into our work is one that is growing and will continue to grow. And I know that many of the task groups that are working to write standards have that in the front of their minds. My approach to uh, risk assessment is a little different, though. It's not so much, well, what are we required to do by the standards? It's really how can uh, risk assessment and that process be useful to us on a daily basis, to all of us on a daily basis. But I am going to use as a reference ANSI E1.43, the performer flying standard, because it's the one that I'm most adept with and most engaged with. There and it has a lot of good stuff about risk assessment to it, as do many of the other standards. I think E1.6, that series of standards, has a lot of good references. That's a recently revised standard and is worth looking at. Another place that I look for information about kind of practical use of this methodology is from the Event Safety Alliance, which has been doing great work over the past couple of years, and which also, by the way, sponsors OSHA 10 and OSHA 30 classes that are relevant to our industry. I had the privilege of taking one very recently, an OSHA 30, and it was pretty good. It wasn't stuff that was entirely irrelevant to us. But that's a good place to look too. In the work that I do with acrobats and circus, uh, as well as with all of the work that we all do, we have to start by recognizing that risk is inherent in what we do. There is always risk involved. There are always hazards involved. And in the world that I live in, you get some of those risks are more perhaps obvious than others, than what we do on a daily basis. And I promised Eddie that I would provide comic relief. You may not be able to see it, but there are actually aerialists up on this truck.
Hey, Jonathan,
Yes.
Michael has asked if you could back up a couple of slides. I think he missed something. Is that the one you wanted, Michael? Or I think go to the E1.43.
That the long list one was one of them.
The long list.
That one.
Take a picture of it.
You can take a screenshot. And all I did, by the way, was I just opened I did this the other day. I opened every standard and I did a word search for it. And I looked at to see what was it. Was it just in passing or was there a real mandate? Because I was curious.
We also prefer that you actually read all the standards on occasion.
Yeah.
And
I got a screenshot. Thanks.
Okay, and in case anybody doesn't know, thanks to the beneficence of somebody's mic is on. Scott, I think it's you. Thanks to the beneficent support of ProSite Insurance, all of the ESTA ANSI standards are available for free download through the ESTA TSP website, or just by Googling, it'll get you there one way or the other. And they are very useful. There are a lot more. These are just the ones that reference risk assessment. So there are a bunch of aerialists on this moving truck in the rain for a festival in Montreal. And, you know, do we have any Montrealers here? They'll be familiar with this. It's an annual parade. Also Montreal, we have, if you can see up in that sphere that's suspended by that crane on that truss, there are a couple performers. This is the White Nights Festival. It was about 20 below Celsius on that night. And there's there's pyro attached to the truss, of course. Why wouldn't there be? So thinking about the risks in the weird stuff, but also in the shows that we do, which are getting bigger and more complicated and more moving parts. This is the load-in of Cirque du Soleil's Zarkana into Radio City Music Hall. And there were probably, I would say, 160 technicians working during that load-in, and you can see the complication of it. We're all familiar with that, but the level of complication, the more moving parts, makes really good risk assessment a more and more important to us. Where I come to this is, and where I would like everybody to leave, is not that risk assessment is something that we're supposed to do, but that it's actually a really useful tool for all of us to have in our personal toolkits all the time in what we're doing. And that it's really sort of, we want to build it like a habit, like brushing our teeth. We want to develop the risk awareness and the practices of risk assessment like brushing our teeth, like a filter that we see the world through, so that it becomes an automatic. Now, Eric likes to say, Eric's here somewhere, that whether we know it or not, we're always doing risk assessment automatically, and I want to bring it more to the forefront. But when you go into a public restroom and you choose which stall to walk into, you're doing risk assessment. You may not think about it, but you are. That's Eric's go-to example. So I've stolen it shamelessly. Thanks, Eric. So really, there are things that keep us from doing it, and those things that we have to pay attention to. I mean, has anybody ever seen anything like this on a show? If you were doing any kind of risk assessment, internally or externally, you wouldn't be doing this, right? But we know that the way we work and the processes and the pressures that we deal with, including, I fear to say it, the show must go on, including the lack of time that we have. We never have enough time. The rush, the pressure, the money, our own sense of invulnerability, our cowboy mentality, if you will. Sometimes a lack of awareness of what those risks actually are.
Jonathan,
Yes.
I think one of the things, and this picture is perfect for it, is that one of the contributing things to accidents is that we've always done something a particular way. For years and years and years, we used to use A-frame ladders with the extension ladder in the middle and sit on the top of it, which was padded with carpet for the purpose to focus lights on wheels rolling around on the stage at 25 feet in the air with four people standing at the bottom. And I know this still goes on in some places, but if you were to do a risk analysis of what you're doing in that moment, you wouldn't do it anymore. Right? So I think that on top of all the other things, the lack of time, working in crowded spaces, working in spaces where things are changing constantly, our own, like you said, sense of invulnerability, and the fact that this is how we've always done it gives us the assumption that it's safe to do, and it's just not. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and we may not have had practice in doing it other ways. We may not have had training in doing it other ways. We may not have the right tools on hand now, while we have to get the show up for an 8 o'clock curtain tonight. So there are all of these things, but we are changing, and there is a cultural shift happening, and we all here are very much a part of that. So I want to now kind of circle back to where Eddie started, and say it to you in the way that I think about it, which you won't find in OSHA's manuals this way. But fundamentally, and Eddie did say this, I think there are 4 questions to ask. Something happened here. Whoops. So, and the first one, and the question that we should always be having is, well, what could possibly go wrong here? What are the hazards? What are the physical conditions that are out there that could bite us in the butt? That's a technical term. We want to ask, what are the consequences if it does? Is it going to be, as Eddie said, a scratch? Is it going to be death? To one or to all, or anywhere in between? What's the likelihood of it happening? A comet falling on the theater would probably have really severe consequences, but is it likely to happen? Well, probably not, or if it is, hopefully it's on a dark day. We'll see.
I think that the likelihood of things happening has changed in some cases. When Steve Edelman, who's I think he's the vice president of the Event Safety Alliance, and a lawyer who works in the entertainment industry, talks about it, he says, what could reasonably be expected? No one in Las Vegas reasonably expected that some madman with a bunch of rifles would sit up in a hotel room, Mandalay Bay, and take pot shots at them and spray them with bullets. But it's not the first time that we've had that kind of violence in an entertainment venue. So now it's something that's more reasonably expected. So it's something that we have to address. It's not as likely as some other things, but it's very severe if it happens. So in that context, you need to look at it.
Right. And then the 4th question, once you've processed these, is really, what can we do to prevent or mitigate it? How do we change the equation here? How do we change the formulation? Now, there are a couple points about these that I find useful, and one of them is, it's really useful to do this in advance, not while you're doing it while you're in the action, but it is really a good idea to have worked through this process well before you're in the action and under pressure, and the pressure is building. so that you actually have a plan and you have an actionable plan. We'll come back to that. The second thing is you have to recognize that the level of acceptable risk is going to be different under different circumstances. And so determining the level of acceptable risk is a part of the action. And the level of acceptable risk is going to be different for, let's say, an acrobat or than it is for somebody who bought a ticket in the first mezzanine to see a show. So given that risks are, Bill, you said acts in capital letters. I'm not sure what Bill was meaning when he said acts.
I'm responding to a question from Camille. Sorry.
Oh, got it. Okay, sorry. I saw the capital letters. I got distracted.
Sorry. Well, shiny stuff.
Yeah, there you go. So I've worked in some places where there are very specific levels of acceptable risk. This place, the risk assessment that we did, by the way, this is well more than the past 4 years ago. So just saying. The level of risk assessment is very specific in this environment. And it would be a little different in this environment. So determining the level of acceptable risk is critical. Going back to the standard, there are some terms that I want to point out and really to lead to the yellow highlighted part, which underlines what Eddie says. Because we need to think about risk assessment not as something we do once or something we do and then we have a piece of paper that that captures that risk assessment. Really, we have to think about risk assessment as a process, and not just a process, a cyclical process that, rinse, lather, repeat, or lather, rinse, repeat until the bottle's empty. Until you're done and everybody has gone home safe at the end of the day. Or in this case, until the risk has been reduced to an acceptable level. So, and this is something where, as when I talk with and work with folks about risk assessment, this is a missing part of the understanding, I think, because a lot of us think about risk assessment as a document, or as something that is a requirement that we do. And to the extent that we can shift that into understanding that it's a process that we're continuing to do all the time in our work and in preparation for work, we're going to be a lot better off. And that's in fact what the standard requires. It looks at it as a cyclical process. So again, going back to the 4 questions. We have those 4 questions. And then, as Eddie said, one of the key parts of doing this work, and one of the tools that we use to do it, is to quantify things. It works a lot better if you quantify things. There are lots of ways of doing it, but here's a typical sample risk assessment table that is a tool to help us decide what we need to deal with, what we need to address, what we need to fix. So we're mapping probability and severity, or likelihood and severity, on this grid. The numbers that we assign to them and the colors are based on what our acceptable levels of risk are. This is just a sample. Your mileage may definitely vary. But you can see that if we've got something that has insignificant consequences and is very unlikely to happen, we call that a 1 and we're good to go. It's green. Whereas if we see something with extreme consequences that is very likely to happen, we're up at 25, and that's definitely red. We got to stop. frankly, those are the easy ones. The ones that are harder to deal with, that take more time and more thought, are the yellows and oranges. And those are the ones where we really have to look at what we can do to mitigate those risks, to bring them to an acceptable level. And we have tools, and this goes back to OSHA, we have tools to help us make choices. And this hierarchy of controls is probably familiar to many of you, but it talks about what are the most effective to what are the least effective tools to mitigate risks. And the first, yes.
Before you go on, let's go back a slide.
Okay.
I wanted to point out that if you look in the event safety guide or on their website, you will see a number of examples of emergency action plans that use this chart, a chart like this, broken down by department and event that's likely to happen, with all of the responses built in based on the likelihood and the severity of the things that could go wrong at different, for example, for wind events, right? Wind at 0 to 5 is very likely, but not significant in terms of severity. Winds that are 45 to 50 miles an hour aren't very likely, but they're very severe if they happen. And they break down their response to those reasonably expected hazards based on a chart exactly like this. Thank you.
And if you start looking at risk assessment, let's say for a hazard like COVID, for example, you will see that a lot of institutions and organizations are using this tool or a tool like it to help them determine levels of risk and mitigation strategies, which is essentially what we're trying to do. So going back to the hierarchy of controls, we understand that the most effective way of dealing with a risk is to get rid of it entirely. So if the hazard, in the most familiar kind of example that we all use, is, let's say there's a bunch of cable that's running across stage left, and we've identified, oh yeah, there's a risk, that's a hazard, and there's a risk that somebody is going to trip over that, particularly in the dark. And if they trip over that, the consequences could be pretty bad, especially with all the sharp edges around them and that pit that's wide open right next to it, the trap. So what do we do about that? Well, the best thing to do about it is to get rid of it completely. Now, if we can't get rid of it, then what can we do? Can we change it in some way to do something that is of less risk? Or can we do engineering controls, ways of keeping people away from it, either by physical barriers? So fall protection is an example of that. What the best thing that we can do about fall protection is to make sure people are not in a position to fall by keeping them away from that edge. However, we can do that in a number of different ways. We can eliminate the edge. We can figure out different ways of doing it. We can attach them to a leash that doesn't reach the edge. Or the fall protection standards cover all of these kind of things. The last thing that we want to do, because it's the least effective, is put on PPE. That's not to say PPE isn't necessary or useful. You have to do it, but it's going to be the least effective thing to do. So, putting on that hard hat, this is Jack. Jack is going to be 5 next month. Jack is my grandson. He's in training. He doesn't get quite keeping the hard hat on the way it needs to be, but he's working at it. He's not wearing his gloves. PPE is going to be the least effective way to deal with it, but it's something that we have to do, and we have to do properly. We have to learn to do it right. Uh, I said before you need an actionable plan. And a lot of times we think, oh, I know about the risk, so I'm going to avoid it, right? Uh, that's not an actionable plan. Uh, uh, and I don't think I need to say more about that, actually. In my world, and Eddie referenced inspection, inspection is always a key part of risk and hazard mitigation in show business generally, and in particularly in the land of circus and performer flying. The standard requires inspections, and it requires those inspections need to be laid out in a way and done by somebody who is qualified uh, to based on risk assessment. What's likely to go wrong, or what could go wrong, and what can we do about it, and where can inspection make a difference? In the circus, there's a long tradition of inspection. We use all available resources to make sure that, for example, in this case, our endless polyester round sling is intact and ready, because that's what we do. The Also in our world, the world of human beings up in the air, we often need to have as part of our risk assessment not just a general emergency action plan, but a rescue plan as well. Now you need that if you are a technician working at height, and we need to know how to get you down if you fall off and are hanging in your harness. But we also have performers who are not in harnesses. They're in the middle of an aerial act 30 feet in the air. On how do we get them down if, let's say, the automation system locks up, or something else happens where we can't get them down normally. This is from Le Rev in Las Vegas. They're practicing an emergency rescue there, which they did on a regular basis, and had a rule that no performer could perform or actually rehearse an act in the space until they had been through rescue training and rehearsal of that. And so I'll generalize to emergency action plans as a whole, but with a kind of a nod towards the rescue part of it. You need to have the plan. You need to have it be in advance. You need everybody involved to know about it. You need somebody in charge. You always need one person in charge. And you need one plan. The only thing worse than having one plan is having six. Worse than having no plan is having six plans. You need to know, everybody needs to be on the same page. You need to have the proper equipment to actually implement the plan. You need to have training, and you need to have regular rehearsal. Yeah.
Can I make a point here?
Yeah.
That when we teach rigging and we teach fall protection, we teach rescue. But there are often times on many jobs where the riggers are the only people who have had training in doing rescue, but electricians are up there focusing lights on the same truss that the rigger was up doing rigging on. And there may be no riggers in the house while they're doing that. This is especially true on trade shows where you've got a big general session and you've got a lot of lighting trusses that are hung and they're in place. People are accessing them via wire rope ladders, but there's maybe one rigger in the house who knows anything about rescue. Everybody on the crew, like you were saying here, everybody involved with this process needs to be on the same page. They need to have the same training, and they need to rehearse this on a regular basis. You know, doing rescue training once and then 5 years later somebody falls and you have to perform a rescue is not very useful. Okay, you're not going to remember everything. So the idea of rehearsing the rescue on a regular basis is really important, and everybody being involved.
And Eddie's point, it's easy to overlook. I came in last year for the first time to design the acrobatic rigging for the Big Apple Circus, which is an interesting blend of very traditional old school and production at Lincoln Center. And normally the way that worked on the load-in is after everybody else was done at night with all the stuff going on in the ring, the electricians would go up would climb the king poles and work in the cupola of the tent at 48 feet. Now, they were in harnesses and they were good about clipping in, but nobody, I mean, this is really true, nobody until I got there thought about, well, how do we get them down if they take a fall and are dangling at 43 feet from the cupola in a place where there's no possible way of getting a machine in there to get them down. It's just not physically possible. And so we changed the practices and we made sure that 1, there was the equipment, 2, they were trained, 3, they never were allowed to climb without a rescue rigger on site and on duty, ready to go. Nobody was happy about that. The rescue riggers who were getting ready to go to bed at that point weren't happy about it. The electricians weren't happy about it because it was cramping their style, but it was a clear hole. Because if somebody had been dangling there, they could have been dangling there a very long time, and orthostatic intolerance and everything else. But we needed to have a way of getting them down.
Jonathan?
Yes, Bill.
If I may, Camille has a question. It's longish. Can you see chat? Can you read the question?
Yeah. Do you recommend that fall protection training always go hand in hand? For example, if you have a rescue team in place on work call, so I think that's situational. While we try not to say it depends, I think we need to make sure that there is, in every given case, and I'm not answering from the basis of standards and what the standards require. I think we just need to make sure that we have a contingency so that if there's a hazard of somebody falling or dangling unintentionally, that we have a way of getting them down. That may not be everybody, or it may be everybody. It's very, very useful for people who are climbing, in my experience anyway, to understand, 1, what's going to happen when they fall, and two, how they can help themselves, for example, in preventing orthostatic intolerance, moving their feet and legs and so on, and doing those kind of things. And 3, that they will be rescued. People need to know that they will be rescued, because what we don't want is panic. Panic only makes things worse. Eddie, you looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in our local, as part of our apprentice program, everybody takes fall protection training, and as part of that, they take rescue training. And it's not because they're ever going to climb or they're ever going to be on a crew where everybody's climbing, but in the event that somebody falls, everybody is on the same page as to what the plan is and can be a useful part of the rescue. Maybe what you're doing is going and getting the scissors lift that's parked over on the dock to get it out there so you can go up and rescue somebody. Maybe it's being the one who ties on the gear so that the person who climbs to do the rescue can haul it up. But you understand, everybody on the crew then understands at least a piece of what's going on. And you have the advantage of having a mass of people, all who have a partial understanding, which gives you a good understanding. And in addition to that, having people who are indeed versed in the climbing part of the rescue and the use of all the gear and everything else. So it's really important that everybody be on the same page, not just
and that is the rehearsal. The rehearsal is not just getting the person down. The rehearsal is, my job is to go call 911. My job is to meet the meet the first responder. My job is to make sure that the scissor lift is plugged in and not blocked before each show. And so everybody does have their own part of the job. The rehearsal, and they know their lines, the rehearsal actually brings them all together. And then you can find out, well, let's see, we had this plan. How long did it actually take us to get that person down? And then can we fix that? And can we do risk assessment?
Well, the funny thing is, when we started doing this training with our riggers back in the late 80s, early 90s, the first time we did a rescue with a very experienced rigger, from the time someone yelled, "Oh my God, somebody's fallen," to the time the person was on the ground was about 25 minutes.
Right.
The second time, it was 7 minutes. That's the value of rehearsing.
Yeah. Not to be overlooked. Scott, yeah, and the large shows, I'll just, Scott, I'm just going to generalize from your point, but see if there's something that I missed. On the large shows and the shows that have the benefit of time and money, among other things, this practice is becoming ingrained. A lot of times we're working on productions that aren't that. We're working on productions where the culture, the budget, the level of staff experience don't have those practices built in. And I see us now in our industry in a place where we are leading cultural change and bringing bringing
Yes,
awareness.
Clifford, how are you?
David Tripp, you have your microphone on.
Not anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Well, maybe. So we're actually participating in and leading that evolution of a risk and hazard assessment mentality, a emergency planning mentality. So I think that's a good thing, and that's really on all of us to keep that going.
And I think it really needs to be consistent, and that everybody gets the training, so that because your crews will change and they're not going to have the same team always working together, having a consistent kind of training, even if it's generic, not necessarily venue specific as OSHA calls for, that goes on to the employer. But for our own sake, to keep ourselves safe, first thing we do is make sure when we show up at a venue that the gear's there and everybody on there knows how to use that piece of gear. Whether you've worked together or not, knowing the gear's there is the first step. And knowing where it is, that it's not locked in a locker someplace, and knowing that everybody you're working with at least has a basic understanding on how to do that.
So Christy asked a question: how do you rehearse in a venue where the workers change frequently, and so forth? Can I, Judy Snyder? Can I pick on you if you're there? Judy is with Local 329. I've had the chance to do some teaching on this subject with them. How do you, and feel free to unmute yourself, how do you in your local and at your venue deal with those issues? Maybe she's not there. Maybe she's watching another program while she's on. Oh well. We'll come back. But Eddie, do you have thoughts?
Bill? Eddie, Eddie, you can. Yeah, this is your show. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, for example, at the one of our venues, the Cow Palace has a 105-foot open steel roof that we rig from, and part of our rigging training there is there's a rescue kit that's kept in the carpenter's office that when we're doing rigging is supposed to be out on the deck, and everybody knows where that is. The years ago they didn't have any kind of rescue system. They didn't have any fall rest system years ago, and part of the insistence was that everybody who works there has the training to work in that venue. And so we do training sessions at that venue, and in order to be a high steel rigger in that venue, you had to have had those, and part of that includes the rescue. Now, the same 20 people who show up to rig there are going to be different every single show. But in order to rig there, you have to have had the training on that particular system, that particular uh, equipment, in order to be able to take that call. So that's the goal. I will admit that there are times when we're so busy we don't actually achieve that goal, but I can guarantee you that at least 75 to 80% of the people who are doing that work have had the training.
Let me emphasize that point for just a second. Um, you're looking at 20 people. If all of them aren't trained and something goes wrong, who do you want to explain that to? That we didn't have the right people in the air, and we didn't know we didn't have people who knew what they were doing in terms of rescue. You don't want to have to explain that to the authorities, to your management or to the family. There is no exception here. And I would, I hear you, Eddie, that you make it 80% of the time. There's no exception here. You have to make sure that everybody who is on site, who is going to be in a responsible position, that they are trained to be in that responsible position. And if you don't have enough people, you don't do the work. OSHA's never going to, listen to any excuse. When they come in, they're not going to go, oh, well, gee, it's okay. You didn't have enough people. I understand.
Right. And
Sorry,
I think the other thing that we have to emphasize from a worker point of view is emphasize to management that it's very clear within the law what their responsibility is here, and that they need to take an active role within this subject in order to make sure that they're in compliance with the law. And most of them are just unaware of that. I don't think they're purposely being obstructionist in getting this work done and getting this training done. They just don't know that it's absolutely required. And when you can cite letter and verse to them out of the laws and out of the ANSI standards, then I think they comply. And if they don't comply, then you have grounds to file a complaint against them.
And that responds directly to Brian Phillips' point in the comments. Generally speaking, and while there are exceptions, my experience is that with the approach that Eddie talked about and the clarity of that, in a non-confrontational, in a team-based way, people and management. I guess sometimes they overlap. There's a Venn diagram of people and management, right? People and management will buy in. At the same time, it isn't automatic, and you have to be the demand for that until it gets ingrained, until there's practice, until they know how to brush their teeth or have the habit of brushing their teeth well settled.
Gentlemen,
Yeah.
there's about 30 minutes left.
I would like to zoom out from this specific conversation and just offer a couple, if you will, tricks of the trade in terms of how to make how to make risk assessment, risk reduction effective. And the first one is
Jonathan.
Yes.
Before we get started down that road, which I want to do, we do have 2 questions in the chat we might want to address before we move on.
Sure. As some unions are doing training, do employers accept that as being training? As management might not be aware, do unions or other people? I'm not sure.
I can speak to
Sure.
that.
What?
One of the issues is that according to the law, the employers have to do the training, or else they have to make sure they have to verify that you've had the training. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, they're unaware of that. So, for example, forklift training. By the law, forklift training has to be conducted and assessed by the employer. One of the things that we've done in a number of our local unions now is we've created uh, labor management trust funds for training, in which case labor puts in the money and they ask that the union take care of performing the training. Las Vegas has a really, really good training program, and the employers actually tell the union what things need to be trained for each venue. And the union carries out that training, verifies it, does the assessments, and gives those to the employer. In those cases, it is accepted by the employer as verified training.
Right.
Um,
But it also needs to be, I'm sorry if you said it and I zoned out for a second. It actually needs to be take into account the specific conditions of the site where the work is to be performed.
Correct.
So doing training and assessment off site doesn't complete the requirement that OSHA has in their standards unless there's something changed that I don't know about.
No, no, no. It has to be, especially for forklift. If you've had your forklift safety training and you show up at a venue, the employer is still obligated to train you in the specifics of that venue, and that's really important because there's a lot of hazards that exist venue to venue that may not be obvious to a new person coming in, even though they may have had the training. There's a lot of things like this. I mean, under the law, the employer is supposed to provide PPE. That's the law, right? I'll bet you that 90% of the professional riggers in our industry carry their own harnesses. How does the employer comply with the law and allow those people to use their own PPE? Well, the answer is they're supposed to assign a qualified person to do an inspection to make sure that everything is up to snuff, that people aren't using worn out equipment, or that it's not uh, homemade equipment or stuff that doesn't meet the ANSI standard that the law requires. So a lot of this comes down to communication between our local unions and our employers, making sure that the training that we're doing meets the demands of the employer and at the same time keeps all of our members safe.
And if I could just underline Eddie's word, uh, communication, and use that as a segue, because so much of this is about communication and about getting ourselves and our attention on the same page. The E1.43 standards and others require sometimes using the term formal risk assessment. And sometimes that scares folks away. Oh my God, it's formal. We have to use blue ink and it has to be done on the full moon while turning widdershins. What does that mean? Uh, to simplify, this is the way I kind of simplify what is most helpful. In an ideal world, more than one person is going to be engaging in this exercise of risk assessment. Even if I'm really smart and know a lot about stuff, I'm going to have a much more complete, more accurate view of the realities in the world if I'm sitting talking to Craig, Eddie, and Dennis about it. One person, so communication there generates insight. Uh, and that is while the E143 standard says that ideally more than one competent person should participate. The exception that they give is that if there's a qualified person um, involved, then that person could do it on their own. And just to refresh folks for a second, I'm going to come back to the previous slide, just to remind folks of the OSHA and other folks' definitions of levels of I'll say levels of competence and authority. A qualified person being at the top of the ladder, but a qualified person may or may not be authorized. So it gets a little complicated. But a qualified person can do it on its own. The standard says more than one competent person should be involved. The general rule is, having a bunch of people, and particularly the stakeholders, the people who are involved, engaged in that conversation, in that exercise, is going to make it better, is going to make it more thoughtful. The second thing that's called for by the word formal is that you're going to write it down. It's not going to just stay in our heads. Even if it's on a little yellow sticky or the back of an envelope, the act of documenting it is important. It's going to make it more real. It's going to create a memory. It's putting aside any questions of documentation for liability, because that's another conversation that we're not really having. It's going to make things work better. If you have more than one person involved who has a stake in the matter, and if you write it down, you're going to have a better process. And that's why the standards call for that. In addition, cycling back to where I started, this is a cyclical process. It's not a one-off. We keep doing it. We keep managing it. And you know what? Once something changes, then we have to look newly. Even if we've ground this thing down to an acceptable level of risk, and then something changes that we did not take into account, we need to do it again and get it back down to an acceptable level of risk. Now, and this is my last slide coming up, and that is a tool in your toolbox and ways of writing it down. I'm going to give you an example of and it's a simplified example of a form that I have used and used in circus context just to help us talk through and walk through the process. We can identify the activity or and the associated hazards, and we can just brainstorm these, and there may be many. And then we look at the risks that are generated by those hazards. Then we use our chart. You remember the chart, and we rank them, and we come up with a number, and we see whether the number is acceptable. And then we identify mitigation actions. We then redo that risk value after mitigation to see once we've applied those, and then we start all over again, and until we're at a point where that 8, which is yellow now, gets down into the green for my purposes. So there's no one way of doing risk and hazard assessment. It wants to be a tool in your toolbox. There are lots of things. You could take a college level course or graduate level course in risk assessment, and that'd be great, but you don't need it in order to do this effectively and to do it effectively every day. I think there are a bunch of questions that I haven't been tracking. Bill and Eddie, are there things that you want to...
There have been a number of questions. I think a lot of them have been answered in the chat. The most prevalent one was kind of, off on a bunny trail about being able to identify who the employer is. Not really our scope today, but I threw a definition of employer, an OSHA definition.
So, and of course, in our world, that gets really complicated because we work, and again, in throwing jargon around, we work in a multi-employer environment a lot of times, and that does have a lot of implications. But that's a whole course on itself.
It does. There's actually a PowerPoint you can get on the OSHA website, like the other one on multi-employer work environments. It has to do with construction, but within that multi-employer environment, every employer has an obligation for safety within it. Whether you're controlling the entire site or you're like a subcontractor, whether you create the hazard or whether you have the obligation to fix a hazard, or whether you're just working and exposing the workers you're in charge of, who are your employees, to a hazard. And we have the added problem of payroll agencies who claim to be the employer of record. We've all heard this, employer of record. If they're not on site directing the work, OSHA doesn't care. OSHA is going to go back to who is directing your work on site. And as far as they're concerned, that's the exposing employer, and the employer has the obligation to keep you safe. And they're going to come down on that employer. So a lot of companies, especially some of the AV companies, like to say, well, I'm not responsible because I'm not the employer of record. That's total BS. They're directing your work, then they're the employer. And that's how OSHA is going to look to it in inspection. And I have that from the horse's mouth.
Yeah, and just to back that up, there's plenty of legal precedent for that, even within our industry, not just in the general industrial world.
Yeah, and apparently in Canada too.
Joel's asking about resources. Joel, there are as many as you want to Google, and you should find one that works for you. The stuff that I showed you today is fairly typical of what a lot of people use, but you can adapt it. Don't feel constrained to use a particular form or methodology. Get out and do it. And then if you find out if the way you're doing it isn't getting you the result you want, then adapt it to something new.
And I think you can find, you'll find a risk assessment matrix on the OSHA website. You'll also find a really good one for our industry on the ESA website, the Event Safety Alliance. They've put a lot of effort into helping shows do risk assessment and mitigation and come up with emergency action plans. And those all work together. Doing an assessment, doing a mitigation are all part of the same tool. So definitely check that out. And you know who has really good resources for risk assessment? The military. Believe it or not, you can go on the Army's website. This is all public document stuff. And they have amazing risk mitigation, because they're talking about life and death risks when they're doing a lot of what they do. So I believe you can check that out as well.
And going back to the ANSI standards, again, the ones that I put up there all have reference to useful material on risk assessment. So in 1.43, there's an annex which talks about it in more depth and I think points to resources. I know that the E16 series has quite a bit that is actually helpful and useful. So this can be an incentive for you to actually go look at those standards, because they can be your friend.
You got more questions, Bill?
No, not at the moment. But
Don't be
shy, folks.
No, I wanted to tell a story. We did a session at the New World Rigging Symposium. Shameless plug for the upcoming New World Rigging Symposium, April 6th, 7th, and 8th. And when we were doing this, Tony Galuppi, who at the time was working for Cirque du Soleil, was talking about doing a risk assessment for a gag that Chris Angel was going to do. And the gag was that they were going to dangle him from a crane over a pool full of sharks in the swamp someplace, and he was going to escape from a straitjacket, I believe it was, hanging upside down from a crane. So Tony had to do the risk assessment on this. And so Tony went to the park where they were going to do this, and
it was crocodiles, Eddie.
It was crocodiles, you're right, it's crocodiles. No, it was alligators.
Alligators, right.
It was in Florida.
Right.
And he asked the park ranger, says, well, how high can an alligator jump? And he said, well, you'd be amazed. They can get 3 or 4 feet out of the water. So if I hang So he went back and assumed, well, if I hang him more than 3 or 4 feet out of the water, he'll be safe. So then, as part of his research, he went back one day just to visit the park and watch what was going on. And he noticed that the alligators would climb on top of each other's backs to get to a higher place so they could get birds and things. And Tony went to the ranger and said, how often do they do that? Says, well, it depends on what they're after, but they'll do what they need to do to get to what they want. So he had to reassess his risk analysis based on research he had done to find out what the actual risk was. He wasn't satisfied with just having found out that an alligator can leap 3 or 4 feet. He had to actually go back and figure out that he can leap 3 or 4 feet from a pile of 4 or 5 alligators. So I think it was a great lesson.
That's really being up to your ass in alligators, right?
Exactly.
What was the name of the band that had the drummer on the roller coaster that got jammed up?
Well, the roller coaster or the platform, the drum platform was Fish.
The drum platform was what? Motley. Eric says it was. Well, Eric says Motley Crue and David says Metallica. The point I was trying to make, they had the drummer, and it was on a moving platform that got jammed up during a conference. There's a video of it, and it was clear that they had not done any kind of a risk analysis or anything, and there was no rescue plan because, people, the crew were kind of, chickens without heads running around trying to figure out how to get this guy down, climbing the track without protection. It's an interesting exercise in how not to do it.
Well, we were talking also about environment changing because we've changed the order that we do things in. And Jonathan had a really good story about an aerialist.
Yeah. And it's an example of how, even smart people whose jobs are to figure this out miss stuff. So in Big Apple Circus last year, we had a wonderful act with Caleb the Daring Horseman riding in circles on Boaz, the beautiful horse, and standing up. And at some point, he reaches out and grabs a fabric, which happens to be held there by a stagehand, and the hoist goes up, and he goes up flying, orbiting up about 30 feet up in the air. And it was great, a great, beautiful act, and well planned and well rehearsed and very functional. And it happened midway through the second act of the show. Well, one day, two acts from the first act canceled for whatever reason. They couldn't perform. And so the director said, oh, okay, let's move Caleb to act one, to this spot in the show. And they went ahead and did that. And the show started, and Caleb went up and he did his orbit, and unfortunately nobody had realized that at that point in the show, there's a guy line from another act that's running down across Caleb's flight path. And so he flew into it. Now he didn't get hurt. He didn't fall. He was aware. He was able to fend it off because he saw it coming. Fortunately, it was light where he was, and there was no harm caused in that situation. But it could easily have been catastrophic. And it taught the lesson, which the team should have known, that you can't make a change, even in the order of the show, without really thinking through the implications and doing the risk assessment on that changed scenario. And I sure learned a lesson on that one.
I think that this brings up another point. We talked about doing risk assessment before a job starts so that you've taken into account the things you know about before the job starts and mitigated them as much as you can. And we talked about reevaluating throughout the workday to keep an eye on things that have changed or things you may have missed in your initial assessment. But we didn't talk about, and this brings it up with this story here, is at the end of the day, talking about how your day went and whether there were any near misses or close calls or things that you might have caught that you didn't. And the idea is not to place blame or anything else, but to learn from those mistakes so that next time somebody says, hey, let's put Act 4 in Act 1, you'll go, okay, what does that actually mean in terms of hazards that may exist when we do Act 1 that don't exist when we do Act 4?
So
And it's a way of teaching ourselves how to ask the right questions and going back to that first question that Jonathan brought up, what could possibly go wrong? Well,
and David says debrief is always a useful tool, and many of us have a practice that the stage manager or equivalent person on a show is doing a post-show report on every show for including near misses, and that gets addressed in notes, and it also gets addressed on a running show in the other part of that, which is the pre-brief, or what I'll call the toolbox talk, that has to happen before you go into action the next time. So if there's a near miss is the wrong word. It's actually a near hit. A near miss is a hit, right? But that those get raised and shared before we get back into it again. So that toolbox talk on the front, the debrief, and the post-mortem on the end are both important. I see a conversation with Eric and Bill. I see Bill. It's 1:28. I don't know what your thoughts are on timeline, because do we?
You know, if people have questions or if people want to continue the conversation, that's fine with me. We usually run a little over, and I'm good to run over. Otherwise, feel free to wander off.
Just let us know where you're going before you wander.
Right.
Right.
I want to bring up something that was touched on a couple of times, but I want to reinforce it, and that's the documentation. And a lot of people shy away from documentation because it's official, it's formal. Oh, OSHA or the AHJ is going to make me do documentation. We don't want to. But documentation in my world serves to remind me of what really happened when I get, I don't know, a week away from it, or 2 weeks or a month, or maybe even just 20 minutes, depending on how well I'm doing that day. It is required. OSHA certainly requires documentation for just about everything, but documenting your risk assessment plans, documenting your training, documenting, your near hits, as Jonathan said. All of those are extremely important. They serve as a record. They serve as a diary that you can reference later. Uh-oh.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I was pulling up a little video.
Was that an editorial comment?
We just had to give you a little sting there on your statement, because it was important. Yeah, and I'll underline Bill's underlining of Eddie's underlining that don't be intimidated by it. It's not so bad, and it's actually going to help you to do that, to document it, to write it down. I have a gift. Sorry, go ahead, Eddie.
I was just going to say, in the event that you do have a mishap and it gets an inspection, people are going to ask, well, have you considered this? Have you done a risk assessment? Have you looked at this before? Is this the first time it's happened? And if you have anything written down, it's better than having nothing written down. At least you made an effort. That's really important to them.
Right.
For fun, Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
No, I was going to change the subject, but you're following on.
Well, yeah, one of the things that is important to remember, if you do have a situation happen that does result in an investigation with OSHA, or the AHJ coming in, especially with OSHA, I found that if you have documentation, that's going to make their job easier. And while they're not going to go easy on you, it'll be less of a confrontational situation. And it might even turn out to be, a healthy, a beneficial situation for everyone.
Yeah.
That's it.
There you go. I have a little gift for everybody, just for fun, that is sort of silly, and you can watch on your own time. Talking, but it's relevant to risk assessment. I'm just putting a YouTube link in the chat. Again, a Big Apple, crazy people doing crazy stuff
Right.
situation. What recommendations would you have when you get pushback from higher ups when bringing up concerns?
Depends on who the higher ups are.
No, I would argue that point.
Well,
I'm
if I'm getting pushback from my department head, it's a lot different than when you're getting pushback from the venue or from management or from your employer.
well, that's true, but the law is the law,
The law is the law.
and you need to stick to your guns. I mean, if there is a hazardous condition, and if the issue is a hazardous condition that has not been addressed, that needs to be addressed, then you need to stick to your guns. And this is something that it's better now than it was, but there was so many times back in the day when people they say, oh, I didn't want to say anything because I'll get in trouble, or somebody will talk about me, or I'll get kicked off the job. Any of those excuses. You got to remember that the alternative is potentially somebody getting seriously injured or killed.
And sometimes it's really not comfortable. And I had the situation again with Big Apple last year, in the creation process, where we were working on a flying effect which had 11 people up in the air and the rest of the cast on stage moving around. And so we're in rehearsal and actually working the effect. And the director said, "Oh, let's try it this way." Again, a change. There's a theme here. A change. "Oh, let's try something this way. Let's run it." And I had to say, "I'm sorry, we have to stop." I walked out in the middle of the ring and said, "No, we have to stop. We cannot run this thing until we have tested it and walked it and made sure that nobody's going to get kicked in the head when they go that way and they go that way." And so we had to step through. It cost a half an hour of rehearsal time to actually walk through and think through. And the director and the producer, watching the clock, were not happy about it. And I just had to say, we just can't do this. We have to do it the way we agreed to do it, which is we don't rehearse a flying gag without having worked it through properly. And that's not comfortable. When there are now 60 people around you, 2 days before dress rehearsal. But yeah, you have to do it.
Yeah, it's the Spider-Man effect.
Say more, Bill.
Well, I mean, that's one of the main reasons that Spider-Man was such a fiasco, was that they were not taking the time to allow for proper rehearsal, proper thought process, proper programming, and accidents were happening. Most of the accidents were mechanical, but Chris walked off the stage one time when he shouldn't have. That should not have happened.
Yeah.
They didn't rehearse it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to the original question. And when you're dealing with management with these things, a lot of this has to do with um, not being confrontational. I mean, if this is an abuse, then yeah, be confrontational. But if it's something you've discovered and it needs to be brought to the attention of management, do it in the sense that, hey, we're all in this together, and I'm looking out for you as much as I'm looking out for myself, and this is what we need to address. How do you want to do it? Um, what you don't want to do is create an adversarial relationship with the people who can solve the problem to begin with. And I think that's something that gets done way more often than it probably needs to happen. Um, I've also had people who are less experienced go up to head riggers and say, I don't think that's safe. We should stop. And the head rigger, having done the risk assessment and the mitigation and having the training to understand what they're looking at, will say, actually, no, this is fine. We know what we're doing. We have done this. This is what we're going to do, if they have the time to say that. And then the other person calls me and says, they're not listening to me. I'm really uncomfortable with this, and I have to go down and do the assessment. So, there are levels of this. I think if you have a concern, you should voice it. You should not be intimidated. You should always voice your concerns. And then you should rely on experienced, trained professionals to explain to you the risk assessment that's been done and mitigations that have been taken, because it can go both ways. But at no time should you not say anything if you feel uncomfortable with something. um, I've had people tell me that, well, you'll never work in this town again, and my response is always, well, I was looking for work when I took this job, so what the hell. Because I've traditionally been the squeaky wheel in those sorts of things. And you're right, Jonathan, it's not comfortable at all often to be the one who has to bring it up. I once told a director that on a show that she couldn't do the act she wanted to do without putting actors in harnesses. And she said, well, then the audience is going to see all the cables that are holding them up. And I said, cables or dead actors? What would you like? You can have it one way or the other. You can't have it both ways. And she relented eventually. Right? You absolutely have to put your foot down and say, nope, that's not how we do things here. So, okay.
But show business being as collaborative as it is, finding a way of finding that collaborative problem solving methodology and involving all the folks who are involved. Again, it works so much better if you do it before the stuff is hitting the fan. It just works so much better that way. And thinking ahead of the curve. I know I didn't mention it. In addition to all the other stuff that I get myself tangled up with, I'm also a commercially licensed airplane pilot. And the expression that is commonly used when you're analyzing accidents is, you often hear it said, oh, they let the airplane get ahead of them. They were behind what was happening. And it works so much better, and you avoid so many risks and hazards if you get ahead of it. If you're thinking ahead of what's going to happen, sometimes being in the moment is great, but it works better if you've actually thought your way through the path where you're trying to go.
Yeah. Okay.
I like that one. Plane getting ahead of you. I like that. That's a great analogy.
Yeah. Well, and so everybody do this. That's the kind of the end, the last word. It worked to build New York skyscrapers, and there you go.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Any other
last words?
Any last words? Anybody want to got a horror story or a positive story? Yeah, Brian Martin, I like his comment. Yes, Stuart's got his hand up. You don't have, just
go ahead, Stuart.
Early trainings, man, early trainings. No, I just want to say, it's been a pleasure, working with all of you guys. I think, sadly, the way that COVID hit us, we've kind of gotten a lot closer. We've done a lot of these meetings, and I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Uncle Bill, for letting us play in your sandbox.
My
Thank
pleasure, guys. You did a great job. Thank you very much.
All righty. Then we will talk to you soon, I guess.
Yeah. This session is being recorded, and it will be posted on the website sometime on Friday. Sarah usually gets to that around midday.
Save the chat, Bill. Save the chat.
The chat is saved also. As far as I know, Sarah puts the chat up along with the recording with the video. I'll make sure that happens, or at least I'll ask politely.
Very good.
That's my risk assessment.
Politely.
Yeah, politely. Thank you all, folks. Have a good afternoon. Have a safe afternoon. And next week we have Ground Support Trust with Elmer. Elmer Veith will come and join us, because I'm liking this, getting other people to do all the talking thing.
Are you going to schedule it during one of the USITT seminars also, of course?
Well, I'm not able to keep track of the USITT stuff. So it will be at the regular Wednesday 2:00 time next week. Is next week is USITT, right?
Yeah, it is. You're getting a reward of some sort.
Yeah.
He is.
They ran out of interesting people or worthy people to give it to, so they're going to give it.
Such modesty.
Yeah, I don't know. All right, guys. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Stay safe out there, especially you, Stu. Be careful down there.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.